Can you help me with a question about translation challenges? It's about the major challenges at the lexical level.
The options are cultural terms, pronominal forms, idiomatic expressions, proper names, function words, a and d only, a and c only, and b and e only.
Let's analyze each option. The first one is cultural terms.
Cultural terms are definitely a challenge in translation. They often have specific meanings that are tied to a particular culture, which can be hard to convey in another language.
Exactly. The next option is pronominal forms.
Pronominal forms can be tricky, but they usually have equivalents in other languages, so they might not be the biggest challenge.
True. Now let's look at idiomatic expressions.
Idiomatic expressions are another major challenge. They often don't translate directly and require finding equivalent expressions in the target language.
Right. How about proper names?
Proper names can be difficult, but they are often transliterated or kept the same, so they might not be as challenging as idiomatic expressions or cultural terms.
Agreed. The last option is function words.
Function words like the or and generally have direct translations, so they might not be as challenging at the lexical level.
So, the major challenges at the lexical level are cultural terms and idiomatic expressions.
I need some help with a question about stylistics. It's about the major figurative processes.
The question asks which two major figurative processes are included in stylistics. The options are foregrounding, narration, critical analysis, parallelism, representation, foregrounding and narration only, foregrounding and critical analysis only, and foregrounding and parallelism only.
Let's break down each term. The first option is foregrounding.
Foregrounding is definitely a major figurative process. It involves making certain elements of the text stand out to draw the reader's attention, often through deviation or repetition. It's a key technique in stylistics for emphasizing particular aspects of the text.
Exactly. The next option is narration.
Narration is the act of telling a story, which is important in literature, but isn't specifically a figurative process in stylistics. It's more about the structure and delivery of the story rather than a technique used to create figurative language.
Right. Critical analysis is another option.
Critical analysis involves examining and interpreting texts to understand their deeper meanings. While it's crucial in literary studies, it isn't a figurative process in itself. It's more of an analytical approach.
Agreed. The next option is parallelism.
Parallelism is a major figurative process. It involves the use of components in a sentence that are grammatically the same or similar in their construction, sound, meaning, or meter. This technique can enhance the rhythm and balance of the text, making it a significant stylistic device.
Yes, parallelism is definitely a figurative process. The last option is representation.
Representation refers to how language and literature reflect or depict reality, which is important in stylistics, but isn't specifically a figurative process. It's more about the content and portrayal rather than a technique.
So, the correct figurative processes are foregrounding and parallelism.
That matches the option foregrounding and parallelism only.
Exactly. The other combinations like foregrounding and narration only and foregrounding and critical analysis only are incorrect because they include options that aren't figurative processes in stylistics.
Can you help me with a question about translation and translator competence according to PIM 2003? I'm having trouble identifying the correct tendencies.
The question asks which tendencies can be identified with regard to translation/translator competence according to PIM 2003. The options are competence as a summation of linguistic competencies, competence as no competence as translation deals with the actual use of languages, competence as a multi-componential notion, competence as supercompetence, competence as a summation of linguistic competencies and competence as no competence only, competence as a summation of linguistic competencies, competence as no competence, competence as a multi-componential notion, competence as supercompetence, competence as a summation of linguistic competencies and competence as supercompetence only, and competence as no competence, competence as a multi-componential notion, competence as supercompetence only.
Let's look at each statement. The first one is competence as a summation of linguistic competencies.
That makes sense. This view sees competence as the sum of all the linguistic skills required for translation.
Yes, it's a valid perspective. How about competence as no competence, as translation deals with the actual use of languages?
This suggests that instead of having a static set of skills, competence is demonstrated through the practical use of language in translation, indicating a more dynamic and situational approach.
Right. This acknowledges the practical nature of translation work. Next, we have competence as a multi-componential notion.
This means seeing competence as comprising multiple components, such as linguistic, cultural, and technical skills, which aligns with modern views on the complexity of translation.
Exactly. Now, let's consider competence as supercompetence.
This implies a level of competence beyond regular linguistic abilities, perhaps integrating advanced problem-solving and adaptation skills specific to translation.
Yes, it emphasizes an advanced and exceptional level of competence in translation. So, the correct tendencies according to PIM 2003 should be all these viewpoints combined.
That matches the option competence as a summation of linguistic competencies, competence as no competence, competence as a multi-componential notion, competence as supercompetence.
Exactly. The other combinations are incorrect, because they either leave out or mix the tendencies inappropriately.
Can you help me with a question about matching authors with their works? It involves matching List I with List II.
What are the items in the lists?
List I has titles of works, and List II has the names of authors. The titles are Understanding Language Testing, Understanding Pragmatics, Understanding Semantics, and Understanding Phonetics. The authors are Jeff Verschweren, Patricia Ashby, Dan Douglas, and Sebastian Lobner.
All right, let's start with Understanding Language Testing. Do you know which author is associated with this work?
I believe Dan Douglas is known for his work on language testing.
Correct. So, Understanding Language Testing matches with Dan Douglas.
Next, we have Understanding Pragmatics.
Jeff Verschweren is well known for his contributions to pragmatics.
That sounds right. So, Understanding Pragmatics matches with Jeff Verschweren.
Now, let's look at Understanding Semantics.
Sebastian Lobner is a prominent figure in semantics.
Yes, that's correct. So, Understanding Semantics matches with Sebastian Lobner.
Finally, we have Understanding Phonetics.
Patricia Ashby has done significant work in phonetics.
So, Understanding Phonetics matches with Patricia Ashby.
The combination Understanding Language Testing, Dan Douglas, Understanding Pragmatics, Jeff Verschweren, Understanding Semantics, Sebastian Lobner, and Understanding Phonetics, Patricia Ashby.
Alright, let's start with Understanding Language Testing. That one is by Dan Douglas, published in 2010.
Next, Understanding Pragmatics. Jeff Verschweren wrote that, and it was published in 1999.
Now, Understanding Semantics. That's by Sebastian Lobner, published in 2002.
Finally, Understanding Phonetics. Patricia Ashby wrote Understanding Phonetics, and it was published in 2005.
Perfect. Now, there's another similar question. This one involves phonology and generative grammar, Introduction to Phonological Theory, a course in phonetics, and generative phonology. The authors are L. Hyman, P. Lady Fogg, H. Roberts, and M. Konstovich.
All right, let's start with phonology and generative grammar.
That's by L. Hyman, published in 1975.
Correct. So, phonology and generative grammar matches with L. Hyman, 1975.
Next, Introduction to Phonological Theory.
That's by H. Roberts, published in 1976.
Right. So, Introduction to Phonological Theory matches with H. Roberts, 1976.
Now, A Course in Phonetics. That's by P. Lady Fogg, published in 1975.
Yes. So, A Course in Phonetics matches with P. Lady Fogg, 1975.
Finally, Generative Phonology. That's by M. Konstovich, published in 1979.
Great. So, Generative Phonology matches with M. Konstovich, 1979.
Let's put it all together. Phonology and generative grammar, L. Hyman, 1975. Introduction to Phonological Theory. H. Roberts, 1976. A Course in Phonetics. PLAD Fogg, 1975. And Generative Phonology. M. Konstevich, 1979.
Can you help me with a matching question about different types of adequacy in grammar?
What are the items we need to match?
We need to match the following: external adequacy, internal adequacy, observational adequacy, and explanatory adequacy with their descriptions. The descriptions are: this adequacy is a judgment based on the internal characteristics of the grammar. This adequacy is achieved when a grammar generates all of a particular sample of data. This adequacy is achieved when a principled basis is established for deciding the relative merits of alternative grammar, and this adequacy judges a grammar in terms of how well it corresponds to the data.
All right, let's start with external adequacy.
External adequacy sounds like it would be about how well a grammar corresponds to the data it is supposed to describe.
Yes, that matches the description. This adequacy judges a grammar in terms of how well it corresponds to the data.
So, external adequacy matches with this adequacy judges a grammar in terms of how well it corresponds to the data.
Next, we have internal adequacy.
Internal adequacy should be about the internal characteristics of the grammar itself.
Right, that fits with this adequacy is a judgment based on the internal characteristics of the grammar.
So, internal adequacy matches with this adequacy is a judgment based on the internal characteristics of the grammar.
Now, let's consider observational adequacy.
Observational adequacy seems like it would be about generating a particular sample of data.
Yes, it matches. This adequacy is achieved when a grammar generates all of a particular sample of data.
So, observational adequacy matches with this adequacy is achieved when a grammar generates all of a particular sample of data.
Finally, we have explanatory adequacy.
Explanatory adequacy should involve establishing a principled basis for deciding the relative merits of different grammars.
Exactly. It fits with this adequacy is achieved when a principled basis is established for deciding the relative merits of alternative grammar.
So, explanatory adequacy matches with this adequacy is achieved when a principled basis is established for deciding the relative merits of alternative grammar.
Let's put it all together. External adequacy. This adequacy judges a grammar in terms of how well it corresponds to the data. Internal adequacy. This adequacy is a judgment based on the internal characteristics of the grammar. Observational adequacy. This adequacy is achieved when a grammar generates all of a particular sample of data. And explanatory adequacy. This adequacy is achieved when a principled basis is established for deciding the relative merits of alternative grammar.
I need your help with a question about Chomsky's hierarchy of grammars. We need to match the types with their corresponding grammar names.
What are the items we need to match?
We need to match the following: Type 3, Type 1, Type 2, and Type 0 with their corresponding grammar names. The grammar names are RG, regular grammar, CSG, context-sensitive grammar, CFG, context-free grammar, and UPS, unrestricted phrase structure grammar.
Sure thing. The main objective is the grand quest. That is, to explore the relationship between the use of modern teaching techniques and the student performance. So that's the main objective, the grand quest, to explore the relationship between the use of modern teaching techniques and the performance of the students after having applied those modern teaching techniques on the students. So it's like a grand quest overall. That's main objective. That's the main objective.
Type 3 corresponds to regular grammar, RG. It represents the simplest type of grammar in Chomsky's hierarchy, which includes regular languages that can be represented by regular expressions and finite automata.
Correct. So, Type 3 matches with regular grammar, RG.
Next, we have Type 1.
Type 1 corresponds to context-sensitive grammar, CSG. These grammars generate context-sensitive languages and are more powerful than context-free grammars, but less powerful than unrestricted grammars.
Right. So, Type 1 matches with context-sensitive grammar, CSG.
Alright folks, now we're talking about the star of the day. Who is it? triangulation.
Exactly. So, type 2 matches with context-free grammar, CFG.
Finally, we have type 0. Type 0 corresponds to unrestricted phrase structure grammar, UPS. These grammars can generate any language that can be recognized by a Turing machine and include all recursively enumerable languages. So, type 0 matches with unrestricted phrase structure grammar, UPS.
Let's put it all together. Type 3, regular grammar, RG. Type 1, context-sensitive grammar, CSG. Type 2, context-free grammar, CFG. And type 0, unrestricted phrase structure grammar, UPS. This matches the option type 3-RG, type 1-CSG, type 2-CFG, type 0-UPS.